Hello, on behalf of Jester Politics, I'd like to welcome you to our seventh video in our constitutional series, Attacks on Our Free Speech Rights, Part 3. As we discussed in the previous video, attacks on free speech by the government during the 19th century were pretty bad. Sedition Act of 1798, closing of newspapers in the Civil War, and of course the Comstock Act. But that was all just amateurish stuff compared to what was to come in the 20th century. With America's entry into World War I, President Wilson, with bipartisan support from Congress and near universal support amongst the media, got the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 enacted. Now, I think everybody has to agree that a nation has to keep its military secrets secret, especially during time of war. However, these two acts went far beyond that. The reason given for enacting these two statutes was to prevent the enemy from obtaining critical military information. However, the real reason was to stifle the widespread and growing opposition to America's involvement in the war. During the first year that the Espionage Act was in force, 74 newspapers lost their mailing privileges, and numerous people were arrested, prosecuted, and jailed for such things as distributing pamphlets opposing the draft or the war. Not satisfied with the sweeping nature of the Espionage Act, Wilson, in a bipartisan effort of Congress, again with the mainstream media in support, had the Sedition Act passed in May of 1918. This law made it unlawful to use any language that was, quote, disloyal to the government, the Constitution, the military, or the flag, close quote. The maximum sentence that could be imposed under the Sedition Act was up to 20 years in prison and or a $10,000 fine. By the end of the war, there were over 2,000 cases filed and over 1,000 convictions. World War I ended in 1918, and in 1919 the country was rocked by a series of bombings, which the government and the news media blamed on radicals and communists that they claimed numbered between 100 and 600,000 people. Actually, it turned out they numbered about 20,000. But not to worry, President Wilson's Attorney General Mitchell Palmer created the Bureau of Investigation, which was a forerunner to the FBI, and appointed young J. Edgar Hoover as its head. Under this leadership, the government, with the support of the media, created the first Red Scare and used this to target people whose speech they disagreed with. However, they had no evidence that anyone actually committed a crime, so they used the Immigration Act of 1918 to round up immigrants who belonged to organizations that advocated the violent overthrow of the U.S. In two nationwide raids, Hoover's gang rounded up between 3,900 and 6,200 people. Of these, 556 people would eventually be deported. Two would be convicted for crimes not related to the bombings, and the rest had to be released because they were either American citizens or immigrants that did not belong to any party advocating for the overthrow of the government. Palmer had to cancel his plans for future raids when it got out to the American public just how brutal these raids were. However, as for accountability, well, Palmer retired into obscurity, and Hoover took his 450,000 files on people that he considered radicals and became the head of the FBI. 2 years after the end of the Second World War, the government, again with the able assist of the media, created the Second Red Scare. It used that as a means of suppressing disfavored speech. However, unlike the first Red Scare, they didn't round people up for deportation or attempt to send them to jail. Instead, the government intimidated the American public into self-censoring. Those who didn't often lost their jobs and or were shunned by the community. The height of the Second Red Scare was reached in '54 under McCarthy, or McCarthyism, where thousands of people have lost their jobs and were shunned by their communities. Finally, the Senate turned down McCarthy, censored him in 1954, and 3 years later, upon his death, the Second Red Scare came to an end. The Second Red Scare wasn't even over when in 1956 Hoover instituted what he called his counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO for short. Under this program, the FBI not only used illegal wiretaps and infiltration of organizations they deemed subversive or radical based on their speech, but also intimidation and leaking false and misleading information to the friendly press, and even forging letters they would send to individuals' spouses and employers attempting to cause them social, economic, and family hardships. Who were these radical organizations, you ask? Well, the KKK, Black Panthers, Communist Party, members of the Civil Rights Movement, free speech advocates, and of course the anti-war protesters, and even women's liberation movement. This program continued from 1956 until 1976 when the Church Committee investigated them and released a damning report. Of course, no one was held accountable, and J. Edgar Hoover continued his ways as the head of the FBI. The latest threat to our free speech rights came when the Biden administration worked with several of our top universities and attempted to coerce, or did coerce, big tech into censoring speech online. These efforts were very effective in preventing people from talking about the Hunter Biden laptop from hell, COVID, the Russian collusion hoax, and a lot more. In fact, they went so far as to have Department of Homeland Security start a disinformation board that was going to work with Stanford University and a couple others to identify, quote, misinformation and disinformation, and then collude with big tech companies that would work with them and coerce those who wouldn't into suppressing this information that they just didn't want out there. Luckily, that became public knowledge and had to be shut down rather quickly. In summary, I think history teaches us that if we want the government to protect our liberties, we have to demand that they do so. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye.